Let's get started. So as you know, today is the day we have our first guest speaker. So we're going to spend the first 30 or so minutes doing a bit of a mini lecture on the general topic of being Black in Appalachia. Obviously, our guest speaker will fill in a lot of the blanks on that topic, but I will just quickly give us a few details to take and run with. So I wanted to start out with a few housekeeping notes. So as you know, our first major assignments are due in the coming week, and we have Monday off for Martin Luther King Day. We have a number of Martin Luther King Day events going on through Center College. I would like to bring your attention to two. So you have two parts of the convocation that will be taking place this coming Monday. The first of which is a multi-faculty member panel discussion and response to ongoing violence. So the panelists will include my colleague in the IST program, Dr. Dina Beatty. So I'm very excited about that. And at 7 p.m., there will be the annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. convocation. The title of this convocation is The Power of Promise. So registration is open for both events. Y'all should have received an email this morning from Dr. Andrea Abrams with information on how to register. I would encourage you to do so as soon as possible. So this week's documentary, I'm going to have you watch it over the weekend. I just watched it myself last night. It was very, very good. It's the 2018 documentary Hillbilly, which is available on Hulu. And your reflection on the documentary will be due this coming Wednesday, the 20th at 12:30 p.m. And for that reflection question, the text is as follows, and I'll post this to Moodle as well, announce it on Moodle. So how does the 2016 presidential election shape the film's narrative? Do you find yourself being more sympathetic to Ashley or her Trump supporting family members? So for me, and I don't want to give away any of the plot, but she has a grandmother who is just the coolest person I've ever seen in my life. Predictably, the grandmother is a massive Trump supporter, but also just a total badass. So for myself, I find myself somewhat conflicted on that question. So if you are intending to not watch the film, you don't have access to Hulu, or you just don't want to watch it, that's fine. In the case that you don't want to watch it, I will have you write a reflection response instead on what you were getting wrong about Appalachia. So instead of writing a 300-word reflection on the documentary, I'll have you write a 300-word reflection on the book from last week. So I'll let you reach out to me if you're in that camp, and no worries if you are. I also wanted to bring your attention to some additions I've made to the class Moodle page. So there's now a section on the Moodle page for weekly quizzes and assignment submission. So the first quiz will go live this evening, and it will be due at Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. So that will be found under weekly quizzes. I'll also circulate the link via an announcement. And all of our written assignments ought to be submitted into that assignment submission tab on Moodle. So there's already an entry there for our first written reflection, the first weekly reflection, which this week is going to be due on Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. due to the Martin Luther King Day holiday. But generally speaking, those reflections from now on will be due on Mondays by class time. And I'll also put up a assignment upload link for the reflection for Hillbilly, which is due Wednesday by class time. So let's talk a little bit about the Black community in Appalachia. So the region is at present home to 2.5 million Black residents. The Black community in Appalachia through the region comprises about 1% of the region's total population. However, it is growing in comparison to other demographics, or to be more precise, the Black population in Appalachia is not shrinking at the same rate as other populations. Black residents are staying in Appalachia, while residents from other demographics are leaving the area. Its highest concentrations are in the Appalachian counties of Alabama, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. About 26 Black residents live in the Appalachian counties of Kentucky. So we will be talking about Harlan County today as having a very specific historical importance for the Black population in Eastern Kentucky and being a capital of sorts of Eastern Kentucky's Black community. So Black habituation, if not settlement in the region, dates all the way back to the early part of the 1500s. Black slaves took part in multiple Spanish expeditions in and around Appalachia throughout the 1500s. The rise of the coal industry in the late 1800s and into the 1900s subsequently brought an influx of Black workers from the Deep South. By the 1900, about 20% of West Virginia's coal miners were of Black ancestry, ethnicity, race. So I'm going to show a demographic map produced by the Appalachian Regional Committee, a regional commission, to give you a sense of the distribution of the Black population in the region. If everyone's finished taking notes. So as you can see, the I guess the hexagons are the areas of the highest concentration. They tend to be most prominent in parts of Georgia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. So the southern part of Appalachia is more heavily populated with Black residents. Kentucky within Appalachia, with a few exceptions, has one of the more sparsely populated Black communities in the region. So Kentucky is actually one of the 10 most predominantly white states in the country. So Kentucky, somewhat less racially diverse than other, or at least the counties of Kentucky and Appalachia, somewhat less racially diverse than other counties in the region. So let's talk a little bit about one of the exceptions here. So a town in Kentucky, and actually a town that I would have loved for us to travel to on a field trip under normal times, is Lynch, Kentucky, which is a historical mining town in Harlan County, Kentucky. And it has, especially in the past several decades, emerged as a cornerstone of Kentucky's Black history. So here is the Black Coal Miner Memorial, located on Pirate Way in Lynch. So it's a town that at its height had a population of 10,000. And at its height, it was a very cosmopolitan and multi-ethnic and multicultural town that was home to miners from 38 different nationalities. So one of the magnets of Black workers in particular to Lynch were a set of fair wage policies and equal pay policies that were enacted by the United Mine Workers Union that operated the mines. These were unionized mines in Lynch. So these policies drew thousands upon thousands of Black migrants from the deep South, where they were predominantly in the Deep South, employed in cotton cultivation and the cotton industry. So 1923, the Lynch Colored Public School opened to educate the children of Black residents. And at present, about 20% of Lynch's population is Black. So Black people who settled in Lynch have subsequently been more likely to stay in Lynch than other demographics that have populated the area at various points in time. Lauren, you have a question?
Yeah, just touching on the 38 different nationalities, I'm not 100% sure if it was Lynch, but I dated this guy in high school whose mom was born in India, but she grew up in Harlan County because her dad was an engineer, and they asked him to come to Kentucky to be a mine engineer. And I know that they were in Harlan County. So definitely a lot of diversity, even back in like 70s, 80s, 90s.
So I got a lot of flack for this when I mentioned this to, I had some students that are from New York, Connecticut, but I mentioned when I first came to Kentucky, one of the things that really surprised me is how decent the pizza is here. I had a student from New York, her head exploded when I said that, but I was surprised coming to Kentucky with things like Fazoli's and in, okay, this is probably another objection. It's not from Tony. Okay, so people who've lived in the Northeast have strong opinions about this. But I was surprised by Fazoli's. In Lexington, one of my favorite places to go is Grimaldi's. A lot of that dates back to the deep roots of the Italian mining community here in Kentucky, and specifically in Eastern Kentucky in mining towns. Tony, of course, has a visceral objection to the statement I just made about pizza in Kentucky, but I stand by it. Out of curiosity, has anyone here ever been to Lynch?
I think I probably have. Do they have a coal mining museum there? I think that they do have one, and it's supposed to be really good. My dad loves it. He's kind of obsessed.
They do. Yeah, so that's going to be top of the list for field trips the next time I teach this course. And Kylie, you were also telling me about the documentary Harlan County, USA.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah. Everyone should watch it. It's on YouTube for free.
Did it get into like black miners in Harlan County at all, or?
Not really, but I think that you can see a little bit of diversity in the film itself. But it won like a lot of awards. I remember. I don't know what the awards are called for movies. Emmys? I don't know.
Oscars, I think.
Oscar? I don't know. But they won a lot of those for that.
So yeah, actually, it comes up in the movie we're going to be watching, or a lot of you are going to be watching this weekend. And this was one of the first film portrayals of Appalachia that portrayed the population with a certain level of dignity, as opposed to caricaturizing the population. So it comes up in Hillbilly. And I'd imagine the next time I teach this course, I might go ahead and show it. I'm going to definitely have to dig it up in the very near future. Chat is just blowing up. Yeah, does seem like the Black church in Lynch is popping. Actually, they interviewed for Kentucky Educational Television the pastor of the Black church and the first lady of the Black church in Lynch. And actually, I want to brag a little bit. There was something really, really cool that happened on my Twitter account. So y'all know I'm obsessed with Twitter. It's like unhealthy. But I had a really, really cool interaction today with Kentucky Educational Television that, since I brought it up, I have to share with you. So earlier today, I tweeted in reference to Kanye West's bomb of Taylor Swift at the 2019 MTV VMAs. I'm gonna let you finish, but KET is the best educational public broadcaster in the entire country. 3 exclamation points, to which KET replied, "This isn't Dora the Explorer, is it? I was trying to figure out what cartoon this is from." Is that Tony saying -1? I don't know what. Anyone know what cartoon this is? Or I guess Molly and Denali. But anyway, so getting a tweet from KET, one of the coolest things that's happened to me on Twitter. Yeah, I got to tell y'all later on about a time I got dragged by Swifties because I made a tweet on the hashtag I dumped Taylor Swift because, and the Swifties didn't like it and they just completely swarmed me. That's the story for another time. So one other aspect of Appalachia is it has a very important and often forgotten history as part of the Black liberation movement. We often when we think of Black liberation, we often think of the Deep South. We often think of states like Georgia and Alabama, but right here in Appalachia, a lot of very important touchstones in that movement, in both abolitionism and civil rights took place. So before the Civil War even began, Berea College over in Madison County became the first non-segregated and coeducational college in the South. A few years later, in 1859, abolitionist John H. Brown led an anti-slave raid in Harper's Ferry, Virginia at the time, West Virginia today, at a federal armory there. And by doing so, he attempted to spur a region-wide revolt. So this was a very important pre-Civil War abolitionist act of provocation that foreshadowed the conflict to erupt in a few years. And in 1932, and this is a really cool piece of trivia, Miles Horton, photographed here with his wife, Zilphia, founded the Highlander Folk School in Jefferson County, Tennessee, which was the first desegregated K-12 education school in the region. A very interesting and fun fact about this school is that Zilphia was the head of the music program. In that capacity, she has been credited for popularizing a number of now iconic civil rights era hymns, paramount among which is "We Shall Overcome." So an absolutely iconic hymn that at this point is indelibly associated with the civil rights movement, perhaps more than any other piece of music. So I want to play for y'all a recent rendition of the piece that I found quite powerful. This is a rendition performed at the White House for then President Barack Obama and then First Lady Michelle Obama by folk singer and activist Joan Baez back in February of 2010.
First Lady, your family, you are so much loved. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome. Dr. King realized that nonviolence fight went far beyond the shores of this great country, went far across the sea to war that was being fought by God's children on both sides of that great fight. And he knew that he had to speak out against that, and he was afraid. He was very afraid. So we all raised our voices just a little bit louder. And we said, we are not afraid today. We are not afraid today. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I know that I do. We shall overcome someday.
So an absolutely iconic rendition of an absolutely iconic civil rights hymn with a massively important history and roots right here in Appalachia. So we have about 5 minutes, I believe, before Dr. Frank X. Walker is scheduled to come and join the call. So if y'all wanted to use that time to take a quick break, run to the bathroom, whatever, we can do that, and we will get back into the lecture when Dr. Walker is on the call. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
I guess welcome home remotely. Welcome to Danville remotely.
Doesn't really feel the same.
So I am so honored to introduce our special guest. I decided to go with the abbreviated bio for the introduction. So Frank X. Walker is the first African-American writer to be named Kentucky Poet Laureate. He's a professor of English and African-American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, where he founded Pluck, the Journal of Appalachian Arts and Culture. He has published 11 collections of poetry, including Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, which was awarded an NAACP Image Award for Poetry, and the Black Caucus American Library Association Honor Award for Poetry. He is also the author of Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York, winner of a Lillian Smith Book Award, and Isaac Murphy, I Dedicate This Ride, which he adopted for stage. Voted one of the most creative professors in the South. Walker, a Danville, Kentucky native, coined the term Affrilachia, co-founded the Affrilachian Poets, a Cave Canem Fellow. His honors also include a Lanham Literary Fellow for poetry, and not included in his bio, he's a graduate from the Danville High School, where he was twice elected class president. He also holds honorary doctorates from the University of Kentucky, Transylvania University, Spalding College, and of course, Centre College. Frank X. Walker, Dr. Walker, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
I was flabbergasted. He responded within 5 minutes. I was flabbergasted he accepted. I've never been more honored or more scared to do anything in my career as a professor. And I was reminded of just how daunting this was going to be in my drive here. So I commute from Lexington. The very first thing I saw entering Danville was this sign. Welcome to Danville, Kentucky, home of Frank X. Walker, Kentucky Poet Laureate. So I felt like that might be an appropriate place for us to start. Talk a little bit about your experience of growing up Black in Danville, and how your upbringing in Danville shaped your subsequent art.
Wow. Okay, I'll take a stab at that. I think that the I think the art. I was more aware of what was happening artistically than I was with my Blackness. I grew up in a very insulated community. Less than a mile from Center's housing projects called McIntyre Homes, and I did most of my childhood in that space as part of a large family, as part of a close community of working class, poor, mostly single mothers, and we didn't. That was our community. That was my growing up space. We didn't roam all over town, even though the rich neighborhood was 3 blocks away. I had classmates from there, but they weren't. We weren't social with each other, so we stayed in our own spaces. And I would say that Danville was, even then, was pretty relaxed around issues of race, at least as much as nobody talked about it. It wasn't something that I won't say it was an issue. I think that people just accepted the way things were and just did what they could with with whatever the parameters that existed inside that space. I was raised by a mother who was very creative, and she was my first teacher. She was the first person to put books in my hand, the first person to buy art supplies, to encourage me, and encourage my reading and writing. So, she, between her and what happened at school, and the library bookmobile, which came to our community every Saturday, I was able to live in a world that was much bigger than Danville because of books. We never had enough money to do anything for spring break. So spring break meant spring cleaning at our house. But for me, it meant I had a chance to read more. And in my head, at least, the world of books, I could travel to outer space. I could go to the bottom of the ocean with Jacques Cousteau. I could visit other countries. And even though I didn't come back with a spring break tan like my classmates did, I never felt like Danville was as small a space as it was because of books. The world I lived in was much bigger, and I think my mother encouraged creativity. She believed everybody was creative, and they just had to find a way to use it. And part of that creativity, of course, was born out of having to do more with less. Like my mother. She wrote and directed the Christmas pageant every year at church. So one thing she would do is she would make all of our costumes out of recycled garments. I remember her taking the curtains down in the living room to make angels outfits for the play. And it was just a really rich creative space. So, but I think the downside was it wasn't treated like it was special. I just assumed everybody could make art, everybody could write, everybody loved to read. I didn't know until high school that I was the oddball out in my community. That most people hated reading. Almost nobody wrote poetry, and very few people were artistic. I'm also a visual artist. And so that was, you add that to Little League sports. I was pretty athletic all the way through high school and into college, but Little League football and high school football is huge in Danville. And I came up as part of that tradition. Track and field, football, basketball, ultimate frisbee. That's a very generic summary of my childhood.
Very rich one. So technically, according to the Appalachian Regional Commission, Danville is one county outside of Appalachia. I think it ends in Garrett. So around when did you begin to gravitate toward embracing Affrilachia as an identity?
Well, I think it was during my college years, right when we were when I started traveling around the region as an undergrad and understanding what Appalachia meant. And one of the things I understood really quickly is that, there was a socioeconomic distinction that defined what Appalachia was. But I also understood that something happened that was pretty consistent at the very edge of the official boundary of Appalachia, were these county lines. And in a lot of cases, just like in Garrett County, between Garrett and Boyle County, there's water that separates the two counties. My father's family lived in Clifton, and Clifton is right across the creek or river. It's not much of a river from Garrett County. And my father always talked about walking across there was a metal pipe that stretched the length of the water. And so they had friends across the other side of the water. And it's hard to believe that Black community in Clifton was not as poor or even less economically disadvantaged than the poor white community on the other side of the creek. But as I learned more about the region, I also recognized that when they built those lines, they seemed to consciously make an effort to not include Black communities. I think there was some effort to almost push Black people out of the definition from the very beginning. So one of the things that we were trying to do when we were deciding, what was Affrilachian, is we didn't pay any attention to geographical distinctions or lines, because we realized that, if you were married to somebody on the other side of the creek or the line, or if you had a grandmother on the other side of the creek or the line, my grandfather's brothers went to Berea College that put them in Appalachia. It didn't, I had as much in common with those people as I did with the people downtown in Danville. And in more cases when I was younger. So very early on, and making a point to define Affrilachia as not just a specific people, but people who were left out of the original definition that I encountered. In 1991, when I looked in the dictionary, the definition of Appalachia said white residents of the mountainous regions of Appalachia. So I figured that Affrilachians were everybody else who were not white. And that was good enough for us. So, our original group had Puerto Ricans, Asian Americans. We were pretty broad and diverse. And, the word allowed us to feel included and to claim the space that we were committed to. It's a long time ago.
Still have a very strong recollection, seems like. So sort of in past interviews, you've highlighted parallels between Black storytelling traditions and what you might call Scotch-Irish or hillbilly storytelling traditions. In your view, in your art, as a storyteller, do you see yourself as somebody who borrows from both traditions?
I don't think of myself as borrowing from any tradition. I think that, my sense of storytelling is born out of the books I've been fed. I grew up reading Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew's mysteries, and moved on to Sherlock Holmes. And by the time I got out of high school, went into college and became an English major, I was reading from the canon. So all the things that I had to read and I chose to read shaped my sense of what a good story was. I did understand how important the oral tradition was, not just with songs and stories, but all kinds of music and the family dynamic. But I don't know that if I ever spent time claiming a tradition. And I think there are good stories and there are bad stories. And I don't think any culture owns what's good and what's bad.
So one of your principal accomplishments as an artist is bringing to light forgotten Black stories in the region. In particular, you've done some incredible research and writing on forgotten Black jockey Isaac Murphy. So you, in sort of interviews and footage I've seen of you, you talk about you mentioned the parallel with Muhammad Ali. So for many of us, myself included, Muhammad Ali is synonymous with Louisville, Kentucky. Isaac Murphy, similarly dominant in his sport, horse racing. His legacy, somewhat forgotten in Lexington lore. What directed you to the story of Isaac Murphy and inspired you to reclaim and reinvent that story?
Well, for me, it's not a matter of reinventing. It was telling the whole story. And I think that, when you think about Muhammad Ali, he was the greatest in his sport, and the most recognized athlete of his generation, in the same way that maybe for young people now it would be LeBron James. But Isaac Murphy was the LeBron James or the Muhammad Ali of his time period. Horse racing was the dominant sport, of the era, in the post-Civil War era. And even before, boxing started to grow and even some bicycling was starting to happen, but people really, were drawn to horse racing. And he dominated the sport. He won 44% of every race he was ever in. And he was the first jockey inducted in the Jockeys Hall of Fame. And even today, nobody has eclipsed his record. I happen to live here in Lexington, about 3 blocks from where he used to live. He had a mansion. He and his wife didn't have any children, so they filled it with, silver and oil paintings and lavish parties. He lived like a king even then, traveled with a valet. He was a king of kings then, and it was an amazing life. And I always felt like, the way Louisville claims and celebrates and recognizes Muhammad Ali, there's a street called Muhammad Ali Boulevard, there's a Ali Museum. If you go to the high school he went to, there's a big oil painting in the lobby inside of a nice glass case. There's a picture of him on the side of a building that's about 5 stories tall. Isaac Murphy was that significant for Kentucky, but in a different time. And Lexington is so far behind giving him that same recognition. The beginning of it is the Isaac Murphy Memorial Art Garden, but it's not really that large of a space. It's the space of, it's less than 1 acre, a little bigger than his house would have been. And so we need a street, we need a museum, we need all those things to recognize not just Isaac Murphy, but all the African Americans who were part of horse racing at its birth. Something you don't see when you watch the most famous 2 minutes in sports, in Churchill Downs, the Kentucky Derby on television. You don't see a clue that tells you that at the very first horse race at Churchill Downs that was considered the Kentucky Derby, almost all the jockeys were Black. The hot walkers, the stable hands, the groomsmen, the blacksmiths, almost everybody in horse racing except the owners were people of color. But when you watch Churchill Downs today, you don't see any clue of that. In fact, there's a statue when you first walked in of Aristides, and Aristides is the first horse to win the Kentucky Derby, as if he won without a jockey. And that always troubled me, that they wanted to recognize the horse but not the jockey. In those earlier races, the first 10 or 15 years, African Americans dominated. And it wasn't until after the Civil War when Southern soldiers, cavalrymen, moved into the Kentucky and physically pushed and forced African American riders out of the business, did it change. Many of them went to Canada and overseas and into Russia and became famous. But that story is part of Kentucky's history, and it's not something I learned in school. And as an educator, I'm always drawn to those stories that are important, but were somehow muted or left out or undertold. So I didn't have to reinvent his story at all. I just had to tell it in as clear and honest a way as possible. And when I decided to tell it, I didn't want to just tell his story, because his story is incomplete if you don't include his wife, Lucy Murphy, if you don't include his teacher and mentor and trainer, Eli Jordan, if you don't include his mother, America Burns. And with their whole collective stories included, you get I think, a pretty decent sense of what it was like in that community for everybody who participated in it. That story originally was written for the stage as a stage play. And then a month after the play opened, the book came out. And, the book is still, pretty popular in at least Kentucky high schools and middle schools as a supplement to history courses who've done, books that have done a poor job telling the African-American part of Kentucky history. I think even in my Kentucky history class, they talked about Lewis and Clark, but they never talked about York, who was an African-American manservant attached to, William Clark, who they picked up right here in Kentucky, who traveled with the expedition the whole 3 years, but was never part of the after story, after post-Reconstruction anyway. Initially, people talked about him and he was mentioned in books, but his contribution, not unlike the contribution of people of color in history, has been rewritten over the years to the point where they disappeared. And I'm just, people want to call it revisionist history. I think if the initial story was not correct, then if I correct the story, mine is close to the truth. Mine's not the revisionist version. I'm just trying to get to the truth. African Americans were here, made a contribution, not just in Kentucky, but all through Appalachia. And especially in the Appalachian region, when people unfortunately think it's a 100% white space, when there's so much key African-American history that comes out of this same space. The father of African-American history, Carter G. Woodson is from Appalachia, but, he went to Berea College. And there's so many stories that intersect music and education and sports and theater that are significant to the same space that people unfortunately think is all white. So because of that, these negative stereotypes about the region, about quote unquote hillbillies and being uncultured and unlettered and without anything worth celebrating, are just not true if you tell the story in a holistic way. But that's for historians before me to fix or try to fix or even admit that it was undertold.
So that leads me beautifully to my next question. So a few years ago, you appeared in the documentary Hillbilly, which I think does a very good job of highlighting Black voices like yourself, like Crystal Good, like Bell Hooks. I'm just wondering, since it was filmed right in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, and in a very interesting way, that election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump frames a lot of the story. I'm wondering if you've had a chance to watch the finished product, and if you had, what do you think of the way it's reflected the region and the story that it told about the region?
Well, I'm very proud of my contribution and the film as a product. It was nominated for an Academy Award for documentaries, and it won a bunch of film festival awards because of the quality of the work and the power of the stories that make up the work. I think it does a great job challenging the stereotypes in the same way that my work tries to do at large. It shows a different kind of peoples in the region that you don't normally see. The stories that get all the attention, like Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, is won a lot of critical acclaim because it sold a lot of books, but people in the region hate that story because it trades on so many negative stereotypes of the region that it takes the region backwards instead of forwards. And I think that Hillbilly does the exact opposite. It shows the, progressive political ideas. It challenges the way people think. It shows a really broader stripe of people. Indeed, even though, the filmmaker is obviously in conflict with her Trump-supporting relatives. Because of the timing of it, you get to see the result of their choices. And most people who've seen that film want to know if there will be a part 2. And so the same people can be interviewed and then give now that they have history on their side, to see if they feel differently about the choice back then. Because I think it's painfully obvious that they were tricked and exploited to support him. And he did what people like the filmmaker thought he would do. And it's starting to become clear in these everything that's happening in Washington, D.C. right now is about the truth. But yeah, it's a great piece of art, I think. And it's a great documentary. I'm really proud of my participation in it. I think that, they chose a really good time and slice of American history to get a sense of where people were and how they felt. And it feels a little dated now because it's, 4 years ago. But it does a really good job of talking about where the region is right now and where it can go. And I think I read where you've assigned that, or your students already watched it, or they're going to watch it. But it's
going to be watching it this weekend.
It's an important film. I hope they liked it.
So I'm not alone in this. I am anything but a Trump supporter. But by watching the movie, I found myself rooting for Ashley West's Trump-supporting grandmother. I don't think I'm alone. She was by far and away my favorite character. Just one of these old school, tough as nails, take no guff type of people. So I think it was a really, really cool, and that family dynamic in particular was something that I really enjoyed.
Oh yes, same here.
So that's all I have. In the time you have left, would you be comfortable fielding a few questions from some of my students?
My favorite thing to do.
Wonderful. So ask away, don't be shy. Use the hand raise feature on the chat. So Maddie Jenkins has raised her hand.
Your question is?
Can you all hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Walker. First of all, thanks for coming and talking to us today. It was really nice to hear you, hear your words on Zoom instead of on paper. But I guess one question I had, it was just actually, I kind of thought of it while you were talking, and I kind of heard that you mentioned, you described York as a manservant. And I was just wondering, I'm very interested in like words and like, choosing words because they mean different things for different purposes. And I was just kind of wondering, like, was that an intentional choice to kind of like move away from using the word like slave or enslaved? Or was that just kind of like something that you did like by chance?
No, it's very conscious of, and hopefully it separates him without giving the long version of his experience, because he wasn't just to say he was an enslaved man, kind of defies his relationship with his master, because he carried a knife and a hatchet and a gun. He didn't dress like a field hand. He wore, pretty fine clothing because he traveled with William Clark. Imagine taking your manservant with you to Thomas Jefferson's estate and having him in the room of, taking your coat. Because of where he traveled to in those spaces, he got to dress nicer. He wore good shoes and boots and clothing and coats, and got to stand around in those spaces, silent and muted, but attached to this man of note and worth. So to say he was just enslaved doesn't come close to describing his real role. To say he was a valet would be overstating it, because a valet implies a level of freedom that he did not experience or enjoy. But manservant, to me, is the most accurate way to describe the relationship between him and his master.
It's a really good question, Maddie. Ben Harden.
Hello. First, thank you again for coming to speak with us. So you always seem to find like the what's left out of a story, whether that be a place or a person, whatever voice is not heard from. And I was wondering, because sometimes I know it can be difficult to remember to do that, or even sometimes when you're looking, it can be hard to find those what's left out. So I was wondering how you go about doing that.
Well, I think for me, it's part of it is how you listen. And I always assume the older the story, the more incomplete it might be. There's so many anecdotes I could give you. One of my favorite stories, here's an example. Imagine, now you guys are young, but you still know who Elvis Presley is, right? All right, so imagine, Elvis Presley had a twin who died in utero. Most people don't know that about Elvis. But imagine if you were going to New York City and there were two one-man shows across the street from each other. And one show was everything you know about Elvis, from Elvis's point of view. And the other show was billed as a show about Elvis, but the speaker was Elvis's dead twin brother, who's angry at Elvis for wasting their combined talent, right? One of those shows will be more interesting than the other. So the point of view to me is always as important as the story itself. The storyteller is real key to me. Yeah, I think most people be more interested in Elvis's story from Elvis's dead twin's point of view than from Elvis. There'll be more surprises. There's more unknown. There's kind of a oh my element, because it's not what you would have expected. I think people want that. People are drawn to that kind of thing when they decide which book to pick up, which movie to watch. They want something that's gonna not insult their intelligence. It's gonna teach them something, and maybe even challenge what they believe, depending on what they like and how they want to be entertained. That's one example. And for me, when I'm looking at stories, I feel compelled to look at the margins, at the corners. I don't want the editor to make the decision for me. If I'm watching a film, the filmmaker's already decided for you where you should look, which is in the center of the screen. But unconsciously, because I also teach film, I always look at the edges and what's in the background and imagine what's off screen to kind of fill in the story. And because I've trained myself to think like that, it also works when I'm reading something and I'm trying to figure out what's been left out. What did they not say? And sometimes, people ask me questions that lead me in that direction. My first book about the Lewis and Clark and York experience led me to write a book totally in York's point of view called Buffalo Dance. And towards the end of that book, I talk about York's enslaved wife in Louisville, Kentucky. And almost everywhere I read that book and shared that book across the country, from here to Washington State, people wanted to know more about his wife. more information than I had. And that kept coming up as a regular topic. So when I wrote the second book about the expedition, most of the speakers were women. Even the voice of the river was in the voice of women, of a woman. There were Native American women shamans, York's mother-in-law, York's enslaved wife, York's Native American wife. All these women helped fill in the gaps in the story because I understood that even though York's version of the Lewis and Clark expedition helped round out the story, it was still incomplete if women had nothing to say at all, even though they were part of the experience. Sacagawea or Scatchewea, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is very famous in the Northwest. There are high schools, Lewis and Clark colleges, but the most used mascot in the Northwest is her, as a Native American woman, young woman, who was 15 years old on the expedition, who had a 3-year-old baby when she went along. But what we hear about is Lewis and Clark, Lewis and Clark, Lewis and Clark. And in truth, if you do the research, there were 42 people part of the expedition. But you never hear that in your history classes. You hear about Lewis and Clark, which leads you to think that, these two white male superheroes did all this by themselves. And maybe you hear about Seaman, Meriwether Lewis's dog. But you don't hear about the African-American man, the Native American woman, the French and Indian guides, or most of the other men who made the thing happen as a collective. And that speaks to the power of storytelling. Who tells the story? If the lion told the story of the hunt, it'd be different than the hunter's version of the story. So that comes back again to what I think is important. It's not just a story, it's a storyteller. And I'm drawn to compelling storytellers that by their nature make them more interesting. You don't even know the story that the dead twin brother is going to tell, but you're already compelled to hear it because of who he is in relation to the story. So those are the stories I'm trying to tell and the way I'm trying to tell them and what I'm drawn to as a storyteller and translator of history, historical events that make up these books. I think there are 4 now that deal with historical poetry. Actually 5, because the 5th one doesn't come out to 2022. And that's a 3rd book about Lewis and Clark that imagines York's life 10 years after the expedition.
So since you mentioned Elvis Presley, another fun Elvis fact, he was a natural blonde. He dyed his hair black when he got into show business. He's known for the black pompadour. So Tim Lever?
Yeah. So I was drawn to an interview that you had before where you mentioned that in poetry you tend to favor content and message over form. And that really kind of struck me because for me at least, poetry is often defined by form. So what drove you as a storyteller to choose something like poetry over a more free-form, or I guess typically free-form genre like prose?
Well, I don't know that I chose it over those other forms. I think that I've just had more success with poetry. It's been easier to introduce into the mainstream or into the public space. I'm trained as a fiction writer. I'm just a failed fiction writer because it's taken me so long to finish my first novel, which is even now circulating around the editor's desk at different publishers, hoping for a life as an official book. But I can write a poem in my head driving from Danville to Lexington, but you can't write fiction like that. You can think of an idea. I've written about a dozen plays as part of a community theater group. Isaac Murphy, I Dedicate This Ride was one of those plays. But even with poetry, I'm more drawn to the story, the narrative, and less, I'm less impressed by the form because the form is not something you you hear as much, because I think poetry is an oral tradition. And I'm always thinking about, okay, these are things that are going to be shared with other people, and they're not reading along with you. So when they're reading, they don't hear, quatrain, 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 couplet, and think, oh, wow, what an amazing Shakespearean sonnet. What they hear are the rhymes, whether they're in rhymes or soft rhymes, or they may hear some consonants or assonants, but the thing they remember most is what was the thing about, what was the story element. And for me, I'm always thinking about, reading these things to my siblings or my mother, who probably won't read them for themselves. They just want to hear it. They're not big readers of poetry. And I think that drives, at least my preference. But at the same time, I enjoy writing in form, because for me, it's like an exercise. It makes me sharper. So when I'm in between books, I write in form. I have a whole book of what I call Affrilachia Sonnets. And they take the traditional sonnet form, they're all 14 lines, and they try to marry them to the idea of a blues poem, and the blues ideology, where the blues, not unlike country music, are really about talking about these horrible times and hard challenges, except in most of those songs and the blues, they don't offer a solution. They just talk about how bad it is. My truck broke down, my dog is dead, my wife left me. That's a great country song, that's a great blues song. But what I was trying to do in my Affrilachia Sonnets, the whole collection, is in the last couplet, offer a solution. So it looks like a blues lyric on the page because of repetition. It moves like a sonnet on the page because of the structure and the form. But in the last couplet, it does something brand new that the blues, country music, or sonnets don't traditionally do. It's offer this solution. And I think that is a reflection of how I was raised. And my mother always said that, I didn't have the right to complain about something unless I was willing to fix it or try to find a solution. It's like, if you didn't vote, shut up. You can't complain about, who won if you didn't vote. So it's kind of that, her philosophies and shaping really are a large part of how I move as an artist and a teacher even in the world. I mean, she didn't have, she quit school to be a mother, and then went back to school after her 7th child was born, and ended up becoming a nurse, a registered nurse, and retired as a nurse. But she was the smartest woman I knew. I think if she lived in a different space and made different choices, she'd have been a university professor of something, like sociology, because she loved people and thinking about people's problems and how to solve them. But I went way off that tangent. I don't even remember your question now.
So just out of curiosity, is writing Appalachian Sonnets, would you say, is that part of how you bridge your identity as an artist and an activist?
I don't think it's a bridge for me. I think that if you could read the titles of my poems and come to the conclusion that I'm an activist. When I'm in the classroom, I don't separate it out. I don't try to say things that are not political. And I tell them in advance, I'm not trying to be objective. This is who I am. This is what I believe. And I'm not asking you to believe it, but this is why I believe it. But my activism, people pretty much know that that's what that class is going to be about. If the class is called democracy and jazz, you're not going to get a conservative, summary of classical music and its importance. You're going to get something else that is about improvisation and born, in America as a Black art form that now is part of the whole world. You get that history, but you also get, the dynamics of what it means to merge cultures, because real jazz is, it's influenced by Native America and African America and Europe, and born here in the United States. And it's one of the few original American art forms. But when you talk about it, you have to talk about something that even politically has a particular slant to it. I don't think you can write a poem that's not political. Even trying to do so is making a political position. So I don't worry about separating that or even building bridges between my art and activism. I trust my gut. I try to move towards what I believe is truth and to be honest and respond honestly to what it is I feel and try to be as informed as possible, which means traveling. I think that if anything, people are limited mostly by their experience, and that experience is shaped largely by how much they have traveled in the world, particularly as a young person. It's hard to travel when you get over 60 to really enjoy it, because by 60, you're already who you're going to be. But if you're 17, 18, 19 years old and a college student, you should go abroad every year. You should go see some other part of the world, and you will come back different. Even if you can only do it domestically. I took my son to the Northwest while I was researching the books for Lewis and Clark, and we spent 3 summers in a row on the Nez Perce Reservation. And it shaped him. It really helped him. He was a rising 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grader. And it really gave him a view of the world that he wouldn't have gotten just growing up in an urban space and not leaving it. And it also made him hungry to travel more. So when he got at the university level, I was shocked to get the email from him that he was planning on doing the run with the Bulls in Spain the next day. And I was like, oh no, my son's gonna get gored. But yeah, the travel's important. And that artist activism and the bridging, I think it becomes part of who you are. Shaped by your experience, of course, and how you socialize and who raised you.
So I believe Rachel Morgan has a question.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, go Rachel.
Okay. So I know a lot of your work focuses on forgotten voices, and I feel like until recently, the Black voices of Appalachia have been largely muted. I'm from Eastern Kentucky, and I admittedly didn't realize just how large the Black community, how rich its history was. So I was wondering, as an activist, what advice would you give to help lift these voices up now so they don't become forgotten?
Well, I think it's happening. I think when I was undergrad, there were Appalachian Studies programs, but none of them taught anything that dealt with diversity. They just accepted what the textbooks they had said. But since then, I know a dozen people whose doctoral dissertations dealt with diversity in Appalachia, some facet of it. So I see it happening already. I think anybody, committed who finds that truth, I think your responsibility is to share it, to challenge the false narrative every time you hear it. One of the things I had to deal with as a young person is, the first time I was in Washington State, and I was there as a poet doing a reading, and somebody asked me if there were other Black people in Kentucky. And I was just stunned that, that they believed that, one, that I was the only one, and two, that there might not be any others. And then I realized that what they believed about Kentucky was shaped by, one, the fact they'd never been there, and two, everything in mass media that dealt with the movie Deliverance, Dukes and Hazzard, Beverly Hillbillies, Kentucky Fried Chicken commercials. All those things said it was an all-white space. So part of that helped me decide what kinds of things I would write about as an artist, what kind of art I would make. So part of my commitment and my production has been to trying to force people to challenge their own preconception of this region. That includes, Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky. And as soon as you cross a river and get into Huntington, West Virginia, and then into Charleston, we're talking about, really significant Black communities that people just don't know about. People don't know that there's an HBCU between Charleston and Huntington. But whose fault is that? I think part of it is believing the false narrative. And then, part of my job is to kind of try to force people to look at it differently. I think my group, the Appalachian Poets, there are 40 active members of us, almost 40. And most of us are committed to that idea. We do as much work in the region as we can. We try to do as many readings as possible. I think I've probably been to Appalachian State University 20 times in 20 years to do programs. So at the university level, I see it happening. There are more books. I have a children's book that comes out this year called A is for Affrilachia, and it'll probably be the first Black children's book in the region if you don't count books about, John Henry, the steel driving man, the first man of steel, the first Superman, where the original idea came from, but people don't ever think about that. But yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question. Oh, and read Crystal Wilkinson. I think that's the other thing, is that I'm not the only one doing this kind of work. There are so many of us now doing this kind of work that it makes a difference to see people, from the region. Crystal's from beyond Stanford. So nobody can challenge her Affrilachian identity or her Appalachian identity. She went to Eastern Kentucky University, and all her work is set in Eastern Kentucky. And she's won awards for it. Her novels, her short stories, they permeate. You can't teach a diversity in Appalachia class without using her work, because she's the primary, the main fiction writer currently in that space. But the work's out there. I think you just have to point people to it.
So Maddie, you have another question?
Yeah, unless anyone else has one, I'm not trying to take up too much time.
Just you.
Okay. Dr. Walker, do you care if I ask you 2 different questions?
Is that one of them?
No. So 3, I guess. No. The first one is, what book, if any, do you recommend of yours for diving into your work? Do you think that there's a right way to go? Do you think starting with York is a good idea, or do you think Affrilachia is a good place, or does it matter at all?
Well, I think it only matters based on how you feel about history. If you prefer history over traditional poetry, then I would start with Buffalo Dance, and then read The When Winter Come and I Dedicate This Ride and Turn Me Loose. Those are all historical poetry that deals with historical people and individuals. If you just like poetry, I would start now and work backwards. The book that just came out is Masked Man Black, Pandemic and Protest Poems, and it's put together like the last 10 months. If there was a documentary and the documentary was reduced to poems, then that's what that book is. And it tries to capture everything that's happening around the coronavirus and the national protests that were happening, and when they intersected each other, and overlapped. Because I think that 5 years from now, we'll be talking about this time period as history. Where right now, if you read it, it feels like we're still in it because we're still in it. I think after that, there's a book called Last Will, Last Testament that is born out of a space. We have a 2-year-old here. He'll be 3 in March. Well, right when he was about to be born, we found out my father had stage 4 cancer. And so, it's about, that book is about all the emotional stuff and family dynamics that came about as a result of trying to trace this relationship with a life that was coming into being and then one that was on the way out, and trying to see where they intersected. after that, I don't think it matters, depending on what you're interested in. But there are 11 choices, so choose one.
Will do.
And what's your other question?
Yeah, thank you. The other question is, I was just wondering, do you ever collaborate with the African American Historical Society in Danville?
Yes, in fact, I think 2 years ago, I did a keynote for them as part of a summer celebration that was uptown at the square. But yes, I'm a big collaborator.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
So wonderful. I guess we've taken up about an hour of your time. Thank you so much for your generosity. In all sincerity, this is the coolest thing I've ever been involved with as an educator. So we appreciate.
Get out more.
What's that?
You got to get out more.
This is honestly, one of the things about the pandemic is people who would otherwise be on the conference circuit or traveling here and there, we're all housebound and bored. So, you just kind of have to reach out to people and you never know. But if you told me, from the outset that I would get a Kentucky Poet Laureate involved in this course, I would have said you're crazy. So for me, this is a very, very cool, and for all of us, this was a very cool experience. So I just want to thank you for your time and your generosity with both your time and your expertise. If and when you're back in Danville, there's a bottle of Wilderness Trail bourbon with your name on it that I hope is a suitable recompense for your time here.
I'll be looking to claim that.
Yeah. So they had a bicentennial blend that they made just for Center College last year in honor of the 200th anniversary. So that I'll get one of those with your name on it the next time you're around Danville in person.
That sounds good. Thank you
Wonderful.
for that. I'm a bourbon. I'm almost a bourbon snob to my friends outside of Kentucky. Every time I meet people or poets around the country, that's my traditional gift. We'll end up at a bar and I try to teach them about bourbon. And I'm very proud to know that there's bourbon being made in my hometown. One of my favorite shirts is a Wilderness Trace t-shirt that is now shrunk, so it's almost too small for me. So I got to come back and, post-COVID and get a new shirt. But thank you for your generosity. I look forward to claiming that.
Wonderful. So I'll let you go. The rest of us, let's stick around a bit to debrief.
All right. I'm out. Thank you,
wonderful
guys.
rest of your afternoon.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Dr. Walker.
Thank you, Dr. Walker.
Most welcome.